before we jump off, a moment to think about this title. So if you haven't read it yet, it is above us. The Seduction of Immortality, Palliative Aesthetics, and Life After Death. We figured something really easy breezy for just after lunch. And who better to guide us in this direction than these two fine gentlemen next to me? What I'd love to do is to start out with each of you sharing a bit about how you come to this very expansive topic, and then we'll dig in a bit more deeply. But first, and you have bios, of course, in the program or online, so I will not dwell too deeply, but, and we all know and love Michael, but BJ may be new face for some. BJ, one of the things I really appreciate about your story is that you have managed to face contradictions that many people don't think about for huge portions of their life. You've been able to do that in very present and real ways, and you've been able to communicate that with a degree of grace that I can only hope to one day have. So thank you for offering that. And if you wouldn't mind sharing for folks here who don't know much of your story or how you came to be in this work.
Be my pleasure, and thank you for that sweet comment, Andrew. That's really nice. And it's lovely to be with you both. Well, and maybe, yeah. So my answer to that question is how I came to be kind of this thing. It has a lot to do with being a patient, really. I mean, my interest in this subject really goes back to my childhood, being raised with a mom who has a disability from polio and post-polio syndrome. So I've been in something of a caregiver role my whole life and just watched how the world handled disability and difference and from a very young age. So that's a big piece of the story. But really kind of things took off for me in this direction in college when I was injured. Electrical burns from screwing around on a commuter train. And that really, what I call the cosmic spanking, that was just, whoa, that was just, really there's the world I thought was, and then there was the world that was, and the two were quite different. And so that was a really big part of my education, and being really, okay, we all know we die, right? Most of us probably know that in this room. And we talk about, I'll give my bus tomorrow, this kind of, and it's true. And what that, getting that as a thought, that's one thing, but as a felt reality, that's quite another. And so a lot of my story begins with that felt reality. And then heading back into the world with this experience under my belt and seeing how I could live into it, could make use of it, et cetera.
And actually, let's stay with you for 1 second more, because one part of this title, Palliative Aesthetics, is not one that I commonly see on either side of that two-part phrase. Palliative, I don't generally think aesthetics as integrally partnered, and aesthetics doesn't always come with that. Did you dream up putting these together?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, so it's a book chapter, but that I wrote in a textbook, the Oxford Handbook of Psychiatry and Palliative Medicine.
We all have a copy in your gift
all
bag.
Have it. I'm happy to sign it. Yeah. No, it was an opportunity to put some language around something that I felt was so important and so lacking in healthcare. In my field, I'm a physician. I work in hospice and palliative medicine. So I'm a booster for this word palliative because it's in the world to some degree, but often misunderstood. And in this context, I'm just trying to marry the idea of sort of health, well-being, sort of ease, something that might ease your ability to hold paradox or be with difficult things, and aesthetics, something we all understand to be this very elemental life through the senses, this perceived life. And so from my own experience of surviving that illness, I had a few aesthetic experiences in the burn unit. One that really stood with me was a friend of mine smuggled a snowball into the burn unit, and it was a little piece of nature that I got to hold and feel in my hot skin against the contrast, and have a relationship with this piece of nature in this otherwise unholy, unnatural setting of a burn unit. Unholy is the wrong word, unnatural. Actually, it's quite holy, really. Actually, it's a sacred place in a lot of ways. But anyway, so to not to dwell on it, but I had this aesthetic experience, and it didn't require words. It was very simple. It was very accessible. And in that moment, I got to watch the snowball die and become water at the touch of my hand in this relational way. And it wasn't complaining about going to water. And this end of the snowball didn't really mean the end in general. And there was just something, I'm trying to put words, which is right out of the chutes, something of, if not a mistake, problematic. But it's what we can do. So the language around this was somehow in that moment, it didn't matter. None of the things that I was experiencing, whether I lived or died, you might say, was kind of immaterial. I was just astounded to be around to feel anything, even pain. And so that moment just stuck with me in a huge way. And then as I went back out in the world, I went and studied art for the rest of my college experience and studied perspective and tried to bring this into healthcare because it had been such a healing, therapeutic moment for me. And so back to your question about, I'm sorry I'm going on a little bit, but palliative aesthetics is my attempt to begin to put some structure around this elemental experience that so often gets dishonored in a healthcare setting. And Michael's work reveals this very well. Healthcare hospitals, are essentially anesthetic places at best, where you can hope for numbness. But I think, so for me, I'm interested in having a pulse, sure, and that's kind of where medicine kind of dabbles. But I'm really interested in feeling alive. And what helps me feel alive but these senses? Why am I interested in having a body, and why am I sad to lose it someday, or parts of it any day? Because it feels things. And then I start looking a little bit more closely and kind of outlined in this chapter, what else happens there? Well, it allows us to hold paradox, It allows us to have a relationship beyond the intellect. It allows us to hold a purposeless place, a meaninglessness, the ground from which meaning can spring. It allows for self-expression. And so the list is not short. And it does things magically that the rest of healthcare medicine struggles to do otherwise.
Tremendous. Michael, this
J. Miller, everyone.
This is reminding me of a chapter in your recent book, which everyone, of course, should immediately run out and get if you haven't already. And there's a portion where you're talking a little bit personally about a loss of your own, which I hope isn't too terrible to bring up in public since it is now published in a book. But if you feel comfortable and ready to share a little bit about maybe perhaps what your story was with recognizing a particular loss and how that began to inform how you saw spaces for loss.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Actually, and there's a slide, Jeff, thanks. Thanks for telling us. So one of the reasons I got to connect with BJ and also really started to think more deeply about how is architecture, the space around us, shaping our brain, shaping us in an elemental condition, is because of the story of my father, who was suffering from stage 4 cancer. I often tell the story about how he had 3 weeks to live when he was diagnosed. I went home, and he asked in his 3 weeks, if I would help him restore our family home in upstate New York, and how that restoration project gave him life. He survived for 2 years, and we finished the house, and he told me that working on the house saved his life. It healed him, and that was my entry into architecture. I thought there's this life force in the hope, potentially. There's something real about its effect on our neurochemical relationship to the world around us. Like, it's changing our bodies, it's changing our minds. Is it real? How do I understand that? Stage 4 cancer it's a beast, though. It lasts. And so about a little over a year after I started school, he then got sick again, and the drugs no longer took. And we started to see that he was in decline. Of course, I was in architecture school in denial of everything around me, and didn't really believe that the end was happening, but he knew, and he made a series of new choices. And he chose to die in this home that he had visited once. He had gotten a passport once. Well, I guess that we all get a passport once. He got a passport and he went to one foreign country, and that was Barbados, because a friend of his had a home there that he invited him to. And he had been there and loved the experience. And because we had worked on this family home together, I found out later he didn't want to die in that home. He didn't want to leave this remnant. And so he chose his last room. This is a concept that BJ asked me to consider. What if we could choose our last room and design it? What would it be? You asked me once. And I realized my father actually made that design decision. He chose this room. This is a picture I took. He chose this chair to sit in, and it was a beautiful house which had no doors. A kind of open porch to the living room was open. Birds would fly through it. It was designed for the environment. You could see the horizon. Far in the distance, you could see the ocean. And he chose to sit in that chair. He gathered his 4 best couple friends, my mother, and they all assembled together, and he asked, "Can I let go?" And, excuse me. And it was a beautiful death. I was coming into my final exit interview of my first year of architecture school. I was walking in to meet my faculty member, and I was on the way walking through the trays of the GSD, Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and my mother called me and said, he had passed on the way into the meeting. And so I walked in kind of shook, But my teacher was really amazing. She said she saw me and asked what's going on, and she said her father had just passed away the year before. And I realized, I joined this fellowship of dead fathers, this Dead Fathers Club, And it was a beautiful connection moment where this C parts and you open into something new, a new relationship to the world. And as I learned about it, I realized how much of the design he actually was in control of. He had this stack of yellow legal pads where he was writing down, where he wanted to be, who was going to be with him, what the funeral was going to be like, where he wanted the invitations to be sent. Everything was designed. And that sense of agency, what a privilege, I thought. What a gift that even though he was only 55 years old, he was very intentional about the design of those final days. And he chose, and this goes back to BJ's point, he didn't choose the hospital, he didn't choose drugs that could extend his life. He chose the aesthetic choices of the horizon, of the comfortable chair, of the wind over his face, the temperature and the climate. He struggled so hard to get to Barbados. There's a whole part of the story about him going on this plane with an oxygen tank, and my mother saying he'll never be able to fly again. It was so difficult to get there. And then he got there, and it was this release, So I think he chose aesthetics. He chose space. He chose an architecture to hold him, to allow him to let go. And that broke something in me. I started to realize, where are those moments in our lives where we make those choices, actually? Despite all other inputs that we're getting, we're making choices to survive and to let go all the time. The last room is it's of course not necessarily the last room. Maybe he's going somewhere else. It's a threshold, a transfer moment, a station. But it's the one that we got to see him choose.
It's so tremendous because I think both of you are talking about these moments where, for many humans, fear can be the overriding response. It's unknown. It's death. In many cultures, it's not spoken about. In the culture of this country, death is not something that we generally uplift. And yet what I'm hearing each of you perhaps argue for is an idea that, one, we should at bare minimum recognize it as a reality for every living thing on earth. And two, with that premise, consider what are our duties to knowing that. What are our duties to knowing that death comes for all of us?
Oh, that's a beautiful, important question, Andrew. I mean, for one, just to back up for a second, whatever each of our politics may be, whatever, just think about the world we're currently living in. I wouldn't be able to prove this, but my sense is what's playing out is a lot of behavior that flows from someone got hurt at some point and wasn't allowed to grieve, and wasn't comforted, wasn't offered a lattice of meaning or held. And I think this is the world we get when we don't extend that to each other and ourselves. That's an opinion, it's a theory. I'd love to hear anyone counter it, but that's my sense. So just to frame your question with a statement around the need. And I watched my own experience in medicine, being a physician, and even in a field that tries to, if not celebrate end of life, at least hold it. Yes, celebrate it as a moment of life. And reconnect, we were just talking in the green room. So much trouble flows from this, the wrong supposition underlying sort of medicine since the mid-19th century, which is that living and dying are opposed, and our language gives us away. Death robs us of life, as though it's this foreign invader coming around the bend at any moment. The important truth is that we die because we live. It's a dialectic. You cannot separate the two. And attempts to do so create a lot of trouble. We are then, therefore, at odds with our reality. And I think we see this all the time. So this work has a potential to reacquaint dying with living, and another sort of thread might be reacquainting sort of nature with human nature. Somewhere along the lines, maybe high school English class, I bought into man versus nature. Another thing we're living with the problem is why did we exempt ourselves from nature? And death is can be seen as a rewilding, where people go, oh, right, I'm nature too. And as you both have pointed out, in there, besides a lot of just juiciness, is an enormous connecting force. So far in our systems world, dying is something you do alone or out of the way. Aging is as well, which is this sort of, sneak peek that dying's coming soon, and we just get really weird around it. And so then we end up being isolated for doing the most natural thing in the world. And that's where tragedy comes in. Dying is not a tragedy per se. That's a tragedy. So back to your question. I know I haven't answered your question. Well, I think just responsibility, duty, you can see it that way. I believe we do, because we're wreaking havoc with each other and on the planet when we don't. But I would rather frame it as we get to. We get to kind of this is ancient stuff. We get to reacquaint ourselves with ancient wisdom, reconnect ourselves. So yes, we could frame it in responsibility, but I would love to just see us just really dig into it because it's amazing and beautiful and real, or something like that.
Thank you for a very generous reframe. Sidebar, once upon a time, I got stuck in a grad program where we were doing virtue ethics, and it is really tricky for me to get out of it sometimes, so I appreciate that.
Brother. I totally understand. And there's something to say about the responsibility, the duty. We are fellow humans because we are causing suffering to ourselves and each other when we don't do that. So I'm with you too.
Very gracious.
I mean, I'll just say two things that BJ has taught me is, and we can get into some of this, unique title, but facing death allows us to start living today, BJ said to me once. The existential fear that informs so many of our decisions. And it's not just our anxieties, those are certainly those. and they certainly exist. It's the entire wellness industry that's just composing itself around a sense of immortality or living forever, which is quite literally a tagline of certain influencers. You know, that there's an entire industry being built around extending life without facing the kind of existential questions that we all will, of course, not live forever.
Extending what kind of life?
Yes, extending what kind of life. So I think a really important sense of choosing to design your life and making that choice now instead of afraid to face what's coming down the pike.
When you think about those choices in your work, how do you proceed then? This is sort of a different set of standards to begin with. And then as you think about spaces that people may die alongside or with, how do you build, construct, architect, shape, hold those places?
Yeah, well, that's one of these tactical considerations because it's actually a very real thing in the world. You know, as a design, I've designed, you know, a number of medical facilities where people die in them. I've designed the spaces to cremate them. You know, I've designed spaces to say goodbye to the body, to have last rites, to have views of nature when you're in the hospital bed. You know, and I've gotten to talk to those patients and ask those questions. Do you want to die in a hospital or in the home? And this is sort of the question we're given, this dichotomy, this sort of false dichotomy, as BJ would say to me, that we have one choice, the domestic or the institutional, and in between there is nothing. You know, and that's our choice. That's what medical insurance allows us to choose. That's what the medical industry allows us to maybe consider. And we might just ask ourselves, well, what other choices do we have? What other spaces might exist if we could make the choice? And introducing that set of questions, introducing that set of optionality or agency, again, I think this is all about reconstructing our agency of the built environment and really asking that question of how are you the architect of your life and the architect of the spaces around you as an individual. You go back to your family and ask that question. Will suddenly change, you know, force the question to the medical industry to say, actually, we need more options. We need to be asking different questions when these folks are coming to this stage of treatment or of care, of suffering, you know, of families trying to figure out what their options are, what their choices might be.
It's incredible to hear from you both the degree to which agency becomes part of palliative aesthetics, that it's not simply waiting for an inevitable badness, but rather an opportunity for multiple paths that the person can, with the people they love or care for, or not people, species, plants. In some ways, preparing for this conversation had me rethinking how I think about hope and the relationship between hope and this palliative aesthetic. So I guess I would ask as a final question, as each of you are thinking about your own journeys forward, but also this broader set of fields that's represented here in this room, where do you see spaces for hope in this field of work over the next couple of years?
Well, I'd like you to finish. So let me just say one thing about hope, okay? And I go back to the tactical. There is recent data, recent research that the brain is being changed by the conceptualization of hope. You know, recent analysis, recent neurological research. My father had hope that he could survive, and I truly believe it gave him years of life. You know, so it's not a delusion, like it actually might be neurochemically healing. So this isn't about removing hope. It's not about facing, you know, blind reality either, but that hope could be life-giving. You know, and so spaces that give us hope, and there are spaces that give us hope. The cathedral comes to mind.
A museum,
Spaces of
perhaps.
beauty. What's that?
A museum, perhaps.
A museum like we're in. a space that reminds us, we talked about this, reminds us what we share, not how isolated we become. Those can be life-affirming, and if we do more neurological research, we might actually see that they're medically affirming, chemically affirming. And that is interesting when you do that work, but it's not just sanctimonious and high level. It's actually very real and tactical and neurological.
Yeah, that's a great, I'll just jump off from your comments there, Michael. I mean, so hope, I believe it to be a health-giving ingredient, as good as broccoli, maybe even. But I think you really have to be really careful about hope for what. And so in the medical background, one of the fascinating things, into the space into which, by the way, just think about my field of palliative care, hospice and palliative care, which is essentially the interdisciplinary pursuit of quality of life and the mitigation of suffering. And an enormous mission, ancient, beautiful, huge, and a teeny little subspecialty within medicine only arrived officially in 2006. So it just tells you something. For my money, all medicine would be palliative. All medicine would be attempting to mitigate suffering and promote you feeling alive. But why do we need this little subspecialty to come along and tug on the sleeve of medicine to remind this industry of this very basic elemental pursuit? So it just tells you a little bit about the world we're stepping into. What we're talking about here in some ways is the least exotic, least esoteric thing imaginable. So anyway, with that backdrop, so another little story about medicine, there are lots of studies around this, especially with oncologists who are a very difficult job. And I love you, my oncologist sisters and brothers. It's very hard work. And the systems around it, the languaging around it, the rituals around it can be really, unfortunately, can cause harm. And one of those ways is by not being truthful or sort of partially truthful. It happens all the time, until it's so bleedingly obvious that I'm going to die or death is coming. That's when finally that oncologist or a doctor might kind of yield to that truth. The way it's studied, the by far the number one answer, and this was an oncologist, the study I'm referencing, was, I can't be all the way honest with my patients because that would take away their hope. So sort of a backward way of saying, A, how important hope is, but also really calling out that importantly wrong-headed thinking. Hope is not mine to give or take. And more importantly, hope for what? So I've seen so many times where we finally have this honest conversation with a patient or family, and it's hard. I'm not mean to be Pollyannish. Facing mortality is tricky and sad and devastating and many, many things. But I also watch this sort of relief that comes over people's face. Finally, like they knew something was going on. And so finally someone's sharing reality with them and being honest as a fellow human being. And in some ways, that's where hope can begin. They can reframe. Hope to see my grandkid graduate. Hope to make it to this or that event. Hope for when I'm gone that this or that thing will happen. Hope can take many, many forms. And as a force, it is a mighty one. Where it can go wrong is when you start hoping for, or confusing sort of hopes with plans, like miracles, et cetera. It can set you up for something very devastating. So it needs to be framed. It needs to be encouraged in a way. But as Michael's pointing out, our environments of care can do this naturally. Nature does this naturally. And I think this also points to maybe part of our title here. What is, even as we make a case for us to kind of get right with our mortality, there is some peace, depending if your belief of spirit or soul. I've come to really believe in spirit. That is immortal. You don't have to do anything, And this energy, we know you can't destroy it and you can't create it. It will go on. Whether BJ, go on, I don't know. But I got this relative immortality, the residue, emotional residues I left behind, bodies of work we might leave behind. But as Michael, you pointed out to me when we were together in Nevada City, like a lot of people look to buildings and as being, if I put my name on a building, wow, great legacy, I'll live forever that way. Well, buildings crumble too. So just pick your time frame. I mean, 14 billion years, a lot has happened on this planet alone. So I don't know where I just landed, but somewhere in there is hope, immortality. Let yourself feel those very real things. And also the other side of the paradox. You die and you live forever.
There's not a better ending than that. Thank you both, truly.